Did you know that for 250 years London was a major centre of the whaling trade from the 17th to the early to mid 19th century? I'm standing here today at Bay Wharf in Greenwich, and it's one of my favourite wharfs in London. It's where I first started mudlarking years and years ago, and it's named after the Enderby family, who owned one of the largest whale and seal fishing companies in Britain. In 1775, the Samuel Enderby and Sons Whale and Seal Fishing Company was set up, and by 1791 they owned 68 vessels, many of which were whaling ships. Fast forward to 1829, when Samuel Enderby died, the Enderby's business was going downhill. Why was this? Well, whale and seal populations had been hunted to the brink of extinction. The use of gas in lighting meant that whale oil demand was in decline, and there was also fierce competition from Australian and American whale fishing companies. So it was left to the Enderby sons to diversify, and they set up the Enderby family hemp and rope works here at the wharf, which became known as Enderby Wharf, and years later it's still known as Enderby Wharf. Most evidence of the Enderbys, their businesses and the whaling trade in London has disappeared. But in 2010, a large whale skeleton was discovered in the mud at East Greenwich, not far from here. Richard Sabin, Principal Curator, Mammals, Vertebrates Division of the Natural History Museum, identified the whale skeleton. He invited me recently to go and take a look at it, and I'm so excited to invite you to come with me to meet Richard and to hear him tell us about some Thames whale-related tales and other fascinating facts. Believe me, not many of you will have seen anything like you're about to see. So come along with me now and meet Richard.
I'm Richard Sabin, and I'm the Curator of Marine Mammals at the Natural History Museum in London, and we're actually amongst the national collection of Cetacea, the whales, dolphins and porpoises that are used by researchers from all around the world as a major part of their scientific investigations. It's a collection that's been formed over almost 300 years and represents most of the known living species of whales, dolphins and porpoises. Some of the oldest material that we have in the collection dates back to roughly the mid-17th century.
I mentioned to my viewers that there was a whale discovered in 2010 in East Greenwich, and it was actually you that identified it.
It's a specimen of North Atlantic right whale. This is the really interesting thing about it. It was found during construction works at Bay Wharf near to the O2 Arena on the River Thames, and it was found by literally by diggers, and then the archaeologists told everyone to stop what they were doing. I got a call and was asked to help with the identification. The actual way that the animal bones were laid out on the foreshore of the Thames, really indicative of something that had probably been pulled up by its tail, because the tail was facing up the slope of the foreshore. The funny thing was that there was no head, there was no skull found with the skeleton, and the suggestion there is that whenever the animal was originally stranded, that it was had its head taken away, possibly for the baleen, because the baleen that grow inside the mouth are incredibly valuable. But the key thing, and I'll show you the specimen now, was the carbon dating that we actually did with the specimen. So the North Atlantic right whale is a really interesting species, partly because it's a species that unfortunately we humans have taken right to the edge of extinction. They used to occur in quite large numbers around the British Isles, and they were progressively hunted and taken out, and by the 1920s they were basically gone. So the Northeast Atlantic subpopulation of the North Atlantic right whale was eradicated, and now there are only a few hundred of these animals left off the eastern coast of Canada. Unfortunately, again, they're called the right whale because it was a name that was given to them by the whalers back in the day. They were the right whale to hunt. Unlike a lot of other large whales, when they're resting at the surface of the ocean, those animals tend to have very little of their body visible, just the top of their head. But with the right whale, a significant part of the head and the body is visible, so easy to spot. Incredibly high yield of oil, which was of course one of the primary things that they were being hunted for, but also inside the mouth, these plates, these long plates of keratin. It's the same material that your hair and fingernails are made from, that the animals use to filter food from the ocean. The baleen was actually used in underwear and to make brushes, and was an incredibly valuable material. So that was another reason why that they were hunted. The skeleton itself that we found is incredibly well preserved, and I think, as you know, it's because of the nature of the mud on the Thames foreshore. Sometimes incredibly sticky, anaerobic. Things are really well preserved that can be hundreds of years old. So the majority of the skeleton that we recovered is actually just here.
Gosh, this is it here.
This is it.
Oh my goodness! I was expecting it to be, I don't know, smaller.
Just a few bones, and maybe smaller.
Just a few bones.
They are enormous. And one of the things that struck me immediately looking at the bones was not just the state of preservation, but there are things about the bones. So if we look at these two vertebrae here, you can see down at this point, the bones are actually fused together. And these little nodules of bone and spurs on the surface of the vertebrae, again, they're actually suggestive of the fact that this was a very old animal. So it was probably towards the end of its natural lifespan when it was encountered. Now, whether or not it made its own way up the Thames to the point at which it was found in Greenwich, or whether it was actually taken there, the likelihood is that at the point in time that this animal comes from, and this is another really key piece of information, the suggestion is it made its own way up the estuary and to that point on the river. What really excited us about the specimen when it was lifted and it was cleaned and it was presented to the Natural History Museum as part of our research collection, we managed to get some funding to look at the carbon dates, and there was nothing found in association with it, no coins, no pottery, nothing at all, just literally the bones on their own. The carbon dates came back, and they were really exciting because they put the date for this animal at somewhere between 1590 and 1650. And that's an early specimen for us. Terribly exciting because there aren't too many specimens like this available for study in research collections from the 17th century. And the key thing is that we will be able to extract DNA and other material information from these bones to look at the life of this individual animal and how it compares genetically to the animals that are still living today. But I think the one thing that really struck me, if you think about the 17th century and you think about how the river was being used, lots of vessels coming and going, lots of cargo, London actually at that point just about starting to develop as a whaling port, one of the major whaling ports for Britain. People would have been interested in a large whale being available suddenly on the foreshore. The likelihood is that somebody with some kind of authority would have taken control of the carcass and then allowed members of the public access to take chunks of meat, chunks of flesh away. And ironically, there's an account from 1658 of a similar whale, probably the same species, but from the same spot, pretty much. And this is called London's Wonder. This is from our archives. It says it's the most true and positive relation of the taking and killing of a great whale near to Greenwich, the said whale being 58 feet in length, at whose death was used harping irons, spits, swords, guns, bills, axes and hatchets, and all kinds of sharp instruments to kill her. And at last, 2 anchors being stuck fast into the body, she couldn't remove them, but the blood gushed out of her body as the water does out of the pump. And then it was a process basically of defleshing, dismembering, people taking what was useful to them at the time, and then the bones were basically left behind on the foreshore and sank down 2 or 3 meters into the mud and were completely encapsulated and perfectly preserved.
Gosh, what did you think when you got the call to say we think we found some whale bones?
I was really excited. In all the time that I've been at the museum, just over 30 years now, I've never ever thought that I would be in a position to help acquire a research specimen of this species for the Natural History Museum, given one too that's so old as this. But it was the description that the archaeologists were given when they were on the phone. They said, these bones are huge that are popping out of the mud. They look like propellers. And I thought, oh God, we've probably got a large whale specimen here. And that's exactly what it turned out to be. And one of the things that helped to identify the species were the neck vertebrae. So if we look along this portion of the spine just here, right at the very front, you can see there's a fused block of 7 cervical vertebrae, and this is absolutely characteristic of the North Atlantic right whale.
Right.
But as I say, no head, no skull found, and the likelihood is that at the time that was removed and taken away by someone who wanted to harvest the baleen.
Yeah, I was interested to read that when whales died centuries ago, or even in the 1900s, people would actually get train tickets to come and have a look at the poor creature being killed and chopped up.
Yeah, I mean, it's that opportunity, I think, for people. There's always been a kind of a continuing fascination, if you like, with large whales and dolphins and creatures from the ocean because of their basic invisibility. We don't get to see them very often unless we're actually out on the ocean. But occasionally when one washes up on a beach, it's a spectacle, particularly when it's a large whale. And people will travel miles to go and see the animal. And unfortunately, in some cases, there are accounts of other large whales in previous centuries where it's documented that people were standing on the body, and obviously the animals were quite decomposed or decomposing, and there are accounts of people disappearing inside.
Oh my gosh, no, that doesn't bear thinking about, does
having
it?
to be rescued, from the decomposing body of a whale. Not a great way to go. So with the development of commercial whaling in the 17th century and through into the 18th and early 19th century, those were sort of the key times. That was the key period for that northern whaling, the Arctic whaling, where the key species, the target species, were primarily bowhead whale and the North Atlantic right whale. The ships would go out, they would find the animals, they would hunt them, they would pull them to the ship, and they would basically strip out the blubber. The blubber would be rendered down, and the oil that was taken from the blubber put into barrels. The barrels will go into the hold. The whale bones themselves, the bones of the skeleton, although there is an oil content, it's actually quite difficult to get the oil from the bones. But in some cases, we found that these bones were probably used as ballast by the whaling ships. If they didn't have a completely full hold, a full cargo, they'd use the whale bones to balance the vessel. They come back to London, they'd end up at places like Deptford, Greenwich, into Woolwich, and they'd offload the oil, and then the bones would be thrown into the river. So that's what we find today.
Yeah, and occasionally I've got friends who have found pieces of whale bone. Is that also from the Greenwich?
This is actually from another North Atlantic right whale. Here is one single rib. This is probably the largest rib in the rib cage, to give you an idea of just how vast these animals are. They are beautiful.
They are touching.
Yeah, gosh. Yeah, and as I say, the state of preservation is so good. The likelihood is we will get good DNA recovery from the bone. We're actually standing now in front of a complete vertebral sequence, a complete spine of a North Atlantic right whale, so you can see just how long they are. But on the shelf below is one of the pectoral flippers, so this is one of the forelimbs, and it shows you quite nicely, quite clearly, that inside that paddle of soft tissue that you normally associate with large whales and dolphins, there are 5 digits, 5 individual digits. There are carpal bones, which are equivalent to the bones of the wrist in the human hand, and then you have the radius, the ulna, and the humerus. So it's a complete forelimb. This actually says something about the evolution of whales and dolphins, because 50 million years ago, the ancestors of these animals were running around on land quite happily. Coastal, feeding, progressively moving into the ocean across about 5 or 6 million years of time. They went completely into the ocean, their legs became shorter, the pelvic girdle became separated from the spine, and they were completely dependent then upon life in the ocean. So it was a return to the sea. And this is one of the things that really fascinates me about this group of animals. Really incredible. So this is the item that I wanted to show you. It's actually a fragment of the shoulder blade of a North Atlantic right whale, and it's the lower portion. So if you imagine the rest of the shoulder blade here, and there are cut marks, chop marks, that tell us a little bit about how this may have found its way into the river. The likelihood is it was used as ballast on a whaling ship. The label, I think, is absolutely beautiful. This was applied to the specimen shortly after it came to us in the middle of the 19th century, and it says something like low-level sewer, Bermondsey branch, found in the excavation of the main line of sewer in the ballast 8 feet below the surface, under the sewer where it crosses Church Street. This is Deptford, it's dated 1863. And so you can imagine tons and tons of whale bones being dumped into the river after the cargo had been offloaded from the whaling ships. And the likelihood is, given this is adult size, the animal, we believe that these animals live well over 100 years. So the likelihood is it was probably born sometime in the middle of the 18th century. But I think the thing about the London as a whaling port, it's something that's largely been eradicated from London's history, and there are very few signs nowadays that tell you that that was going on along that stretch of the river, apart from the names of places that still either have family names or locality information, like Greenland Dock.
Yeah.
These tell you a little bit about what the activities were. And I mean, it was a vast industry, you know, it was a hugely profitable industry. London and Yorkshire and other parts of the British coastline, where they were receiving the ships coming back from the Arctic. But by the early 19th century, by about probably 1820, the industry collapsed because they basically wiped out most of the whales in the area. And so attention started to turn elsewhere. It's another fantastic specimen in our research collection, the absolutely huge shoulder blade of an Antarctic blue whale. So the Antarctic blue whales are the largest of the blue whale subspecies that we know, and they really are vast. This was an animal that was collected back in 1913 from South Georgia, and there was a whaling station at South Georgia, several whaling stations. It was one of the major locations for the activities that were going on in the Antarctic. But it was acknowledged that the animals that were being taken at that time were the largest blue whales that had ever been recorded. I think the largest animal that they actually did measure was 33 metres in length, which is just huge. And given the fact that this is over 100 years old, this shoulder blade has been in this position for more than 100 years, there's still oil coming to the surface of the bone.
Gosh, is that oil?
This is genuine whale oil still moving through the bone.
So this really could be the biggest shoulder blade in the world.
Exactly.
That I'm standing next to.
This is actually the skull of a sperm whale.
Is it really?
And these are for me, these are the most bizarrely adapted and one of the most incredible of all of the whales and dolphins. So the sperm whales are the deep divers, they are the extreme echolocators, they are the ones that have in life they have these square profile heads, and actually that square profile is a huge sack of oil that sits on top of the skull. The skull is actually kind of spoon shaped, it's very concave, and it was one of the reasons why the animals were hunted specifically for that oil called spermaceti oil, and it was used for a whole range of different purposes. It was used in cosmetics and in food, but primarily it was used in industry and used for lighting lamps in lighthouses. It was an incredible, valuable material. And it was really the decline of spermaceti oil starts to be seen when there's the discovery of fossil fuel.
Yeah.
And so in a way that was kind of a good thing for the whales, but not entirely. But the skull itself is an incredible thing. Much more complex and much bigger and much heavier than any dinosaur that's yet been discovered. So for me, these are the real sort of champions, if you like, of the planet. The largest brain of any animal is held by the sperm whale. The loudest animal on the planet is the blue whale. So these things are record breakers all round. This is the skull of a smaller sperm whale with the lower jaw in place, and you can see the eye socket, and it gives you a bit more context because the larger skulls on their own tend to be a little bit abstract, in all honesty. But it shows you that really kind of concave, spoon-shaped top of the skull. And this is the area where the huge spermaceti organ sits and holds all of that oil. They really are remarkable things. Echolocating in 1 to 2 kilometres depth of water, complete darkness, using these beams of sound that they produce to find their prey. Giant squid and other things. This is a specimen that I wanted to show you after looking at the Bay Wharf whale and thinking about the brutality that was probably involved in the way that the animal was killed. This is the Thames whale, as we know it, as we name it, from 2006. This is a northern bottlenose whale that swam up the River Thames back in 2006. And I think it's something that a lot of people who are watching your show in the UK and maybe from around the world, because it was a global event, will remember this. It was an animal that appeared in January 2006. We had a call the day before it made its sort of real appearance from the Coast Guard in the Thames estuary to say that 2 large whales had been seen swimming into the estuary. And then on the following day, I was actually travelling into work by train into Victoria Station, got a call from our press officer to say that there was a news crew at Battersea Bridge with some film footage of a large whale in the River Thames. I went down to meet the news crew. There was the animal. Everything kicked off from that point. I realised we were dealing with a northern bottlenose whale. These are deep ocean feeders, and no way should it have been in the North Sea, in the Thames estuary, or the River Thames itself. One of the things that you need to remember too is that, generally speaking, marine mammals are not good in freshwater environments. They're adapted to live and feed in marine. So the fact that this was in the River Thames was a bit of a shock to everyone. We are fortunate in the UK, I think, because we've got brilliant groups like British Divers Marine Life Rescue, who are volunteers based around Britain who will respond to reports of animals in trouble, and they're trained to give assistance. People know the story pretty much, that there was a rescue attempt, that the animal didn't survive the rescue attempt, and she was probably too weak by that point to be rescued and taken back out to open water. And to cut a long story short, after the animal had died and an examination had been made for post-mortem by our colleagues at the Zoological Society of London, the remains were brought to the Natural History Museum to be part of our research collection, to be part of a much broader global collection. And this is where she's been ever since. But the thing that I really like to think about is, you think about the Bay Wharf whale, the Greenwich whale, back in the 17th century, and the way that was treated versus this animal in 2006. It was all about rescue, it was about animal welfare, it was about making sure that the animal didn't suffer. Complete change of attitude. The thing about the Thames whale now is that she was a female, has become an incredibly important specimen in sort of people's psyche and memories. Those people who were in London at the time, people were just starting to use camera phones.
That's right.
And were sort of snapping pictures and sending them to each other.
Yeah.
And it became, it was like a festival atmosphere, thousands of people.
Yeah, I actually remember where I was on the day that the Thames whale was sighted. I was at work in a platinum mining company in London, near Hyde Park, and I was really excited. We were all watching the television actually, and of course we were all absolutely rooting for this whale, hoping that she was going to survive, and then sadly she didn't. But it's great that you've got her here now and you can carry out research. It's
really key for us to be able to acquire material like this, and we're fortunate again in the UK because we have a national strandings, whale and dolphin strandings programme that was actually set up by the museum back in 1913, but it's funded now by DEFRA and the devolved administration. So around the country there are bodies that look out for strandings, record them. There are veterinary experts who go and do post-mortem examination on some of the animals to determine cause of death. The remains of those investigations come to research collections like this and form part of a global resource for scientists, so it's really key that they continue to do that. This collection really is full of surprises, and it's full of material that gets a new lease of life when new scientific techniques are developed, and you never know when something is going to be useful, and this is actually quite an appropriate time to talk about one of my favourite things, which is the earplugs, the waxy earplugs that form in the ear canals of large filter feeding whales like blue whales and fin whales. These plugs are remarkably valuable to us because of the nature of the kind of the waxy material itself. It grabs onto stress hormones, it grabs onto pregnancy hormones, it grabs onto pollutants that are in the ocean that the animal's living in. And a few years back, techniques were developed that allowed scientists to be able to read that information from the plugs and to sort of unpick the life, if you like, of the individual animal. And I worked with a group from the USA back in 2018, and we were looking to see if it was possible to read levels of stress from an earplug, a waxy earplug. And this actually came out of a conference that I was at in 2015. And there were two marine biologists talking about some work that they'd done looking at the remains of 2 blue whales which had unfortunately become trapped in sea ice. And because of the nature of the animals' deaths, they were able to do a controlled dissection and examination of the remains. They talked about the earplugs and how much information they were getting from those plugs. And it made me think of the work that a predecessor of mine at the Natural History Museum had done back in the 1950s. A chap called Peter Purvis, he took some sections through one of these earplugs and realised that they were made up from these very distinct layers of material, alternating bands of light and dark material. And effectively, one light band and one dark band is roughly one season. So feeding, breeding, migrating, moving backwards and forwards. He was able to count the layers in the plug and roughly assign an age to, in this case, a fin whale from the 1950s. For the first time, it was the first time that a kind of age determination had been carried out. But the scientists at the conference in 2015 were hoping that it would be possible to look further back in time, because they'd noticed that the plugs contained stress hormones, and the key stress hormone that they were interested in was cortisol. I was in the audience. My counterpart from the Smithsonian in the USA was also in the audience, and we were able to put together a project with material from whales and whales' earplugs that spanned from 1870 through to 2016, overlapping like sections of a tree, overlapping layers of tree rings to look at changes in climate over time. We followed the increase and decrease in stress levels in these earplugs from commercial whaling, First World War, Second World War, the end of commercial whaling, to see how those stress levels had changed, and they do show correlations. It was a pilot project. It was designed to see if we could actually look at the effects of our activities, humans, on the oceans and the effects on these animals. The incredible thing is that after the ban on commercial whaling had come into place in the 1980s, from the 1990s, you actually start to see an increase in stress levels again. It's thought because there are so many more what we call sublethal stressors that exist in the oceans now than, say, 100 years ago. So things like anthropogenic noise, the noise that we humans produce, changes in sea surface temperatures, other types of pollution, which are affecting far more animals, many more species in far more places than commercial whaling ever did. So it's a really incredible threat that these animals all face. But who knew that we would get so much information from these earplugs?
Is this really whale earwax?
It really is earwax, and I knew my parents would be proud of me that I spent part of my career studying earwax for a living, but it really is fascinating stuff. And
Yeah.
do you know, it forms in the same way that the wax in our own ear canals forms, because, you know, we're talking about mammals, that have ear canals but with no external opening, so they're producing material, they're shedding into those ear canals in exactly the same way that we do on a daily basis. So as well as all of the skeletons and skulls of the larger species that you can see, we also have cabinets full of thousands of other specimens, smaller species, the dolphins, the porpoises. There's one in particular that I wanted to show you again with a London connection, and I think this will really surprise people. So down this corridor here, we have species arranged taxonomically in a systematic way. We have them arranged geographically. And the species that I'm actually about to show you is something that you would normally associate with the Arctic. So these cabinets contain remains of Monodon monoceros. This is the narwhal, beautiful animal that you find up in the Arctic. The really unusual thing is, back in 1949, there were reports of 2 narwhal which appeared, one in the Thames and one in the Medway. And looking at the weather reports, the climate reports for 1949 around the Northern Hemisphere, it was a really cold winter. Lots of ice flows moving down towards the north coast of Scotland. The suggestion is that these animals, these narwhals, were feeding around those ice flows and found themselves in unfamiliar territory, bumping along the east coast of Scotland and England and then into the Thames estuary. Back in the day, back in 1949, the museum wasn't able to recover the specimen from the Thames, but this is actually the narwhal that found its way into
Gosh, so that's a
the Medway.
narwhal skull.
Yeah, this is it. This is the blowhole, these two holes on the top of the head. That's actually the nasal passages of the animal. So instead of being at the front of the skull, they've moved to the top, obviously, for lying horizontally in the water. And then this portion here, this is a female. So the females don't have tusks that erupt. They do have them sitting inside the skull. But if you look at the label, there are two numbers. The first number is this one, SW 1949/18. That stands for stranded whale. 1949, that was the 18th specimen that year to be recorded. It tells you it's a female, it's a narwhal. It was found at Walden in the River Medway.
River Medway.
In Kent.
Yeah, not far at all.
Yeah.
Somewhere else that I like to go quite a lot.
Yeah. If I turn the skull round to look at it front ways on, so we call this the rostrum, it's basically the upper jaw. No teeth in the upper jaw apart from these two sockets that you can see.
Yeah.
Now, even though there are sockets there, the tusks don't erupt in the female, but they do in the male.
Okay.
Usually on one side, and growing to about 3 meters in length. A remarkably well adapted animal for Arctic feeding.
Yes.
Just beautiful things.
Well, it's certainly one of the most interesting draws I've seen recently.
So in this part of the collection, we're looking at the individual left side and right side lower jaw bones of things like blue whales and, in this instance, a bowhead whale. And I wanted to showcase this specimen because it was donated to the museum back in 1888, as the registration number suggests. But the really incredible thing is that the museum decided to turn these bones into a whalebone arch, which is something that you still see in different parts of the UK and around the world. And those people that know the Natural History Museum in South Kensington will know the corner of Cromwell Road and Exhibition Road, and that's where this whalebone arch was placed at the start of the 20th century. And it was there for not too many years because it was starting to suffer sort of random acts of graffiti, as you would expect even then. But an incredibly important specimen for us because the bone itself, like all of the material in this collection, is filled with a reservoir of DNA, stable isotope information about diet and the movements of the animals, so incredibly important scientifically to us. This is a plate of baleen that grows inside the mouths of the large filter feeding whales, the blue whales, the fin whales. And this is actually from our blue whale Hope at the Natural History Museum. You can see though where we've taken lots of pieces out, and this is to analyse the information that's inside the plate of baleen. Again, information about the animal's diet, its movements, incredible amounts of information for us. But also, this is the material that was used extensively in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries for corsetry and in primarily women's clothing, the support structures for those incredible skirts and dresses that people used to wear. Highly valuable material.
So Richard, having worked with this collection here, this impressive collection for over 30 years, what do you feel the prospects are for Wales in the future?
That's a really interesting question, and it's an important one because these collections like this around the world, are so important for us to continue learning about what's affecting these animals, our actions, planetary scale actions, the effects of climate change. We, as a human species, had the good sense to bring in a ban on all commercial whaling back in the 1980s. It was stopped. That's allowed some species to recover in some areas, and there are recoveries going on, but not everywhere. There's still an awful lot of work that needs to be done, protections that need to be put in place. The way that we use the oceans, the amount of shipping that there is, utilisation of resources from and extraction of resources from the ocean floor, all of these things are going to have an effect not just on whales and dolphins, but whole marine communities, everything from invertebrates, fish, right the way through to whales. But we are a much better, I think, informed population, and I'm talking about the global population. You know, we have great content that's generated by other channels on YouTube, by the BBC, by you know, David Attenborough. Those sorts of things that people they consume and they have a passion to know about the natural world. And one of the things that we have been trying to do, and I think we do effectively, very effectively, at the Natural History Museum with our exhibitions, through the research that we're involved with, is we're trying to engage people and help people become advocates for the planet. So the more you know, the more you can do. The more you know about a species, the more you can potentially care about that species and what happens to it. I think there is hope for the future. We've been shown through research that by stepping back from activities, mining, logging, deforestation generally, altering landscapes, modifying them for human use, step back, let those landscapes stabilise, let the ecosystems recover, there is hope for the future. I'd like to apply that to the oceans, but I think there's still a long way to go. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. And the key thing is that these collections are used to generate knowledge about the species, but also evidence about what's been happening long term to these animals in their environment. And so we can make projections then about what may happen in the future if we do well or if we don't.
Well, thank you so much, Richard, for sharing this incredible collection with us all, and also for sharing your expertise and incredible knowledge. It's so appreciated. Thank you very much.
Very welcome.